Okay, hi everybody. My name is Sabina Scheck. I teach here in Public Policy and Environmental Studies at the University of Chicago. I wanted to thank the IME for inviting me to participate in this very important day. And our panel is here to talk about public policy. So we're the social scientists of the day, and we'll be talking about some very interesting, different, and innovative next generation of water policies. We've got 4 speakers and just over an hour, so I'm not going to say too much because we've got 4 people here who know a lot about water policy. So as you all know, as we just heard, Chicago is a great place to talk about water. We've got the Great Lakes, we've got an extensive Chicago waterway system. We use water for transport and industrial uses, agriculture, aesthetics, emotional connections to nature, as we just heard about. So it introduces a lot of different types of challenges. And then when we think about China and the rapid urbanization and growth and how we're all affected by climate change, there's a lot of different aspects to water we need to think about, and we need to think about it from perspectives of economics and law and politics and engineering and equity and all of these different areas that makes it very, we have a real need for very specialized policy. And what's really important here is trying to think about the different ways that we can change the way we use water. And certainly we're going to hear about that from an engineering and a technology perspective, but what we want to talk about here today too is also the behavioral side of that. How can we design policy that changes the way that we use water, which then can in turn influence what we need in terms of future water systems and that. So with that, I wanted to very quickly introduce our speakers. As Steve mentioned, we have extensive bios on everybody here, but I'll just quickly say first we have Professor Don Corsi, who's with the Harris School of Public Policy here at the University of Chicago. And Don has worked on everything from water pricing and water markets to the damage assessment for the Exxon Valdez oil spill. I know you've worked on human health and beach closures, as well as equity, environmental equity in Chicago neighborhoods, which is a very important component to water policy. Next, we have Professor Zhong Ma, who's the Dean and Professor at the School of Environment and Natural Resources at Renmin University in China. Dr. Ma has extensive experience working with governments and international agencies in China, and he's done economic research on pollution markets and trading, environmental finance, and institutional reform. Third, we have Dr. Scott Moore, who is a young professional in the global water practice at the World Bank. Scott will be talking about his experience with transboundary water issues and climate change. He plays an integral role in U.S.-China cooperation on environmental issues and was very involved in the U.S.-China Paris Climate Agreement. And then finally, we have Professor Mark Templeton, who is with the University of Chicago Law School, where he, among other things, runs the Abrams Law Clinic, which addresses critical environmental issues by advocating for legal and policy reform. So we have each of our speakers is going to speak for about 8 to 10 minutes, and then we will start a discussion and open it up to questions. So with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Corsi.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. My story with water starts many years ago. A very close friend of mine and an old colleague, who I hadn't seen for a while, called me from Albuquerque, New Mexico, where he's a professor. And he says, I want you to come out here, I have a problem. And I said, I'm a little busy. Why? Why do you want me to come? Just come. And as you do with really old, trusted friends like that, I went out there and I flew in, and I remember I had been there for a while, flying on the airplane over Santa Fe and then coming down the Rio Grande Valley, and just how small that water is and how thin the green area around it is and how it's so much, almost a joke as a river compared to what we have here in the Midwest. And I didn't know what I was getting into, but I got in the next morning. I said, what are we doing? He said, we're going to a conference. And I said, really? I didn't come here to go to a conference. We're going to a conference. What's the conference about? Water. Water in the Southwest, arid Southwest. We have a crisis here. And I said, well, we'll talk about that later. So we went to the conference all day long, and I learned a whole bunch of things from hydrologists, from engineers, from lawyers, from bureaucrats, from policymakers, and so forth. But I still didn't know why I was there. At the end of the day, we ended up on his roof watching the sun go down over Albuquerque, drinking scotch. And I figured, okay, now we're going to find out what's going on here. And he says, we have a crisis here with water, as we talked about earlier in the day. I said, you don't have a crisis with water here. The problem is it's not priced right, all right? you just built a $5 billion plant to make silicon chips, Intel. And what I learned that first day is that there are two really amazing ways to blow water from your budget. One is to build a golf course in the desert. Another is to build a silicon chip factory, all right? Things are priced wrong. And he says, well, what do you mean? I said, well, you show me yours and I'll show you mine. I said, let's compare our water bills. So it's a little bit apples and oranges, and this is a big part of my talk, getting down to like the personal level here. Both of us had about the same size house. Both of us didn't do anything special. Neither of us had a swimming pool or watered our yard. We both had a teenage daughter at the time. Both of our daughters, the only way to get them out of the shower was to throw a hand grenade in there in the morning, or for the water to run out, the hot water to run out. So we have the same kind of lifestyle. You take my bill and you have to strip certain things off of it. The sewage fee, mine actually has, at the time, a fee for the local fire department, and we had to strip his down. But bottom line was that I pay 4 times as much water as he did at the time. I could hit from my house Lake Michigan with a 9-iron. That's a bit of a lie. It's more like about a 3-iron, but I'm close, right? To Lake Michigan. He lives in a desert with a ribbon of, like a creek running through the middle of his state of New Mexico. And he was paying a quarter of what I was paying for water. Now, as an economist, I'm interested, all right? So he said, what I want you to do is come out here, and I'll fund this thing, but we're going to build a real-time water market for the state of New Mexico. And I thought, okay, this might take a year or so. It'd be nice to go out there a lot, especially in the wintertime. It took 10 years. And I learned much more in those 10 years than I did in the rest of my career about water. But particularly, public policy is really, I guess at its guts, about people and the environment. And over the years, I've tried to write down the lessons that I learned about water and human interaction with water that are important as we go forward with new ideas here at the Institute and at the University of Chicago. And these are things that if you don't realize when you try and apply new ideas to people out there, John and Jane Public, you're really risking blowing the whole deal. The first one is that most of the people in this room realize, and I can't believe I'm going to say this in this building at this time, that there's no such thing as water when it comes to policy. There's no such thing as water. What do I mean by that? I mean, you can't separate the problems of energy, of agriculture, of the environment from water. It's all part of a system. But people, in the comfort of their own home, think about water in the context of this piece of paper or electronic bill that comes once a month, right? They don't think about water as being connected to the Intel plant up the road or the creation of new golf courses in the desert of New Mexico. Secondly, people don't understand supply and demand for water. They think of water as a need, as a right, as an obligation of someone to provide for them. Even my students, which are the best in the world in my opinion, who can recite how ozone holes work, how global climate change is occurring and so forth, oftentimes can't answer basic questions like what's behind the plug over there. They don't know that 70% of what's behind that plug in Chicago might be from nuclear energy, and the rest is mainly from coal. When it comes to water, they use water, they dispose of water, they don't know where, what watershed they live in. I ask my students, when a drop of water hits the property where you live, where does it go? Most of them don't know that. So when economists get scared, when I get scared, I run home to mama. And mama, to me, is supply and demand. And it's very difficult for even me, much less the citizens we're trying to serve, to understand what the real causes of supply and demand are for water. Third thing is about fear. There are 2 glasses of water up here. One of them might be so poisonous if I take a sip of it, I will die immediately. The other one might be perfectly clean. Unlike many other areas of the environmental media, I don't have a lot of sensory equipment associated with figuring out the difference between these. I know if I'm in Mexico City in the afternoon that air is dirty and I can't breathe and it stinks and it feels like I have all kinds of feedback about what is bad or good, safe or not safe. With water, it's a mystery. Because of that, there are many well-known rules from cognitive psychology, cognitive economics that cause fear about water to be different than the fear about other environmental types of externalities. And this can often lead to very irrational types of behavior. Back to my house where I used to live next to Lake Michigan. Each year, the Indiana Department of Environment would send me a piece of paper that says, what are the chemicals in the lake this year? And every year, they were below the EPA standards. Every year, they were going down. But every year, there was a new chemical on the list because now we can measure this at parts per billion. To me, acting rationally, I hope, that's great news. I like to swim. To many of my neighbors in this relatively affluent, highly educated community, it means, oh my gosh, there's a new chemical in the lake, right? One more thing to worry about. So fear is a big issue associated with water, and unlike other environmental resources. Empirics. A few years ago, the EPA asked me to take a fresh look at the economics of water. And it took a long time, and the numbers I'm about to tell you are not hard numbers, but they're close. I found that the average American spends about $800 a year for water and sewage type of systems. That's about 0.8% of the average American household budget. That to me sounds like an unbelievably good deal, right? Almost close to the greatest thing since sliced bread. But how does that work in context? As we move forward, and it's already come up a couple times today, a lot of things we're talking about are going to cost more. The price of water is going to go up. How do we put that into relative terms? $800 a year is almost exactly how much the American will spend voluntarily on beverages, not including alcohol. So on water, right? Drinking water in a bottle or something. On soda pop, on orange juice, right? Voluntarily, we spend about the same amount on those things as we do in the public sector for our water. We spend about 1.2, 1.3% of our annual budget in the household on a cell phone. All right, so we're spending 50% more on cell phones voluntarily than water. All right, water seems like a very good deal, and as you start doing things, as we start to address the future, I think no one in this room is going to doubt that the price of water will probably have to go up. How will that be taken cognitively? And finally, the last thing I want to say about water that makes it different, and we can discuss this more. I'm going to get yanked here in a minute. Infrastructure. When you think about the decisions you make in life and the time frames, they run over a range of times. A big decision is to buy a car or lease a car. That's a decision that might affect you for 3 to 5 years. You buy a house, tough decision. You might live there 10 years, 15 years, you don't know, you might move, what interest rate should I get? Tough decisions. In the area of policy, we have to make decisions over much longer periods of time. An average power plant is a decision to do something for 50 years. A publicly funded stadium will last for 20 years before it needs a complete rehab. These numbers pale in comparison to the numbers that have to do with water infrastructure. Well, it was mentioned earlier that China goes back thousands of years on this. America goes back hundreds of years. When we talk about new water infrastructure projects, we're talking about things that last or expected to last for hundreds of years. And that's the final thing that makes the interaction of policy and water complicated. And I'll be glad to expound upon these points later in my discussion.
Thanks, Don. Clearly 8 to 10 minutes is not enough, as we could listen to Don for much longer. He's just getting started, I think. So, but with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Ma. Would you like to come up here?
Good morning. It's my pleasure to have the talk about the water policy, and this is a good topic. Especially talking about water in Chicago. You have so much water, and I just got yesterday. The Michigan Lake, the total area is 50,000 square kilometers. It's 10 times of the China's largest lake, Boyang Lake. But when we're right now in the crisis, right now only 1,000 square kilometers, because the water control by the three gorges. Talking about water policy, China, we do have very serious condition about water policy because China is a country without too much water. So totally we have the water resource about 3 trillion cubic meters annually. But right now the water use are almost right now is the 1/4 of the total the available water resource. It's a really serious challenge or press. For this about 650 billion cubic meters for water use, about 2/3 used by agriculture, and 1/4 actually used by the industry, and 1/8 used by the people, by the city. So actually, residential use actually in China for water still, so much less than industry and agriculture. But for the 2/3 used by the agriculture, totally free, no charge, and also no any control for the water use and the pollution discharge. We do have the very strong policy for the industrial water use and the residential water use. However, still in the past more than 10 years, you can see several things not really good. One is the water quality in the main water bodies, including lakes and rivers, still very polluted. And the wastewater discharged by the industry, by the residential use, and also the agriculture going up. The pollutant also keep going up. That means the pollution control not under control. So that's a serious challenge. Why? For several reasons. One is still we have a lot of illegal discharge, mainly from the industrial sectors. About half industrial wastewater discharged without any treatment. That's much more than the illegal discharge from municipal sector. For Madam Huang's sector, there's a very good control. But for the industrial wastewater, only half under the control. The other half discharged without any treatment. But the second reason, something related to Madam Huang's sector, that's the emission standard. The emission standard in general very low, because China's the emission standard system, including the environmental quality standard, is nationwide, not mainly by local, it's by national authority set up. So if you compare the emission standard with the required water quality, you will see even the after treatment, the discharged wastewater, in terms of the concentration for the major pollutant, still 3 to 10 times of the concentration in the receiving water body. Because we have not too much water, both the resource and the capacity. So this type of standard system actually discharge a lot of pollution into the water body legally, even after treatment. The third one, for the problem is we charge the water use too less. Totally for all the more than 600 billion cubic meters for water use, the annual revenue for water use, the charge for water use, only about 15 billion US dollars, or 100 billion RMB. It's a very little money. So with this money, you can do nothing. So that is the problem. So how to do this? but the problem is from the public policy. If you check with the public policy for water management, you will see at the top level, for example, for the national law, for environmental protection law, and the water pollution control law, all the laws for the environment protection, but at the very beginning, then the purpose of the law, not only for environmental protection and the pollution control, but also as the role to promote economic development. That's said by all the environmental laws in China. So that's number one. But in general, they prefer, faster growing of the economy. But secondly, talking about in the law, talking about how to set up emission standard. They said to set up emission standard based on the consideration for environmental quality. But also you should think about the technology and the economic situation. That's said also by law, how to set up emission standard. But how to set up the charge, the tariff for water use, also the law said. We set up the tariff to charge a polluter or water user, but you also should consider the polluter's affordability. Also, that's set by our, the state council regulation. So all this, you could see the activity for charge system, for tariffs and for water in China, in general, very low. That's why we have so much limited revenue. So how to do this? Actually, we realized that. Also, I've done a lot of study on the policy recommendation for the authorities. The good thing is, we amended the national laws for environment and also for the air and water on the process. Secondly, right now we are in the first year of the 13th five-year plan. The first time, the national five-year plan set up the goals. We will renew all the environmental standards based on the concern about for the environmental quality, not separate. The third thing is very good. In some cities, including Beijing and Tianjin, not Shanghai, you have too much water. And in Beijing and Shanghai, we raised emission standards dramatically, more than 10 times as before. Also raised the charge for the polluters. So I'm doing this type of study already many years. I'm very happy and also good to do my research in comparison study in US. I collected the water bill in your country. I collected the water bill from the Washington State, OSU, that's in Oregon. Just talked to Steven about your water charge in Chicago. He said very low, $20. But in general, also my daughter living in Vancouver, the charge, same as the Washington State and Oregon. How much? A 3 members family in US, not here, in the Northwest, they pay about $80 per month. That's how much for this. It's the 10 times of the Beijing family paid. Beijing, the city, without water. But the payment by Oregon, even small city, they pay 10 times. 20 times as the averagely Chinese family paid. But people argue, okay, because no people care about the payment in US because it's a little money. I would say yes, but in terms of income per capita as Beijing, I think your income per capita in US about maybe 4 or 5 times of Beijing people per capita income. But your water payment 10 times, much more than your income per capita. It's not the reason. And for another reason, even people are poor or rich, but for 2 things, we have no difference. That's for drinking water safety and for environmental security. There's no difference. Okay, so that means that, for China, we need to improve our policies to provide both the drinking water safety and also the environmental security. Thank you.
Thank Thank you, Dr. Ma. I think we're seeing a recurring theme here that water is too cheap, maybe. So we'll talk more about that. But I wanted to turn over to Dr. Moore, who's going to talk to us about integrated flood management. So.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the organizers of what I think is an extremely important, interesting event, and thank you to you all for being here. So I want to try to do three things if I can squeeze it all in. The first thing I'd like to do is just talk a little bit about how, from kind of my perspective at the World Bank, we sort of think about what good water policy needs to look like, and in particular 5 principles that we think effective, sustainable water resource management needs to have in it. Second thing I'd like to do is talk a little bit about what China's doing in terms of water resource policy reform, because I think it's really interesting and very important. And then third and finally, if I can squeeze it in, talk a little bit about how I think we should try to better integrate the water and climate change kind of policy agendas, because I do think we're appropriately moving to a period in which climate change is sort of front and center for anyone who's interested in sustainability, but at the same time we do have a number of pressing water resource issues we need to make sure are integrated into that agenda. So just to kind of kick off, I don't know how many of you are very familiar with the work of the World Bank, but basically we do 2 things, or we have 2 missions. The first of those is to end extreme poverty, and the second of those is to boost shared prosperity for the bottom 40% of the population by income in every country that we lend to. So no small level of ambition there. What it means in the water sector is that we're one of really very few, I think, organizations that kind of work across the sector, all the way from building small diversion weirs for irrigation to big hydro dams to water pollution control, and then all the way to providing strategic policy advice on water resource management, which we have just started a big project to help the Chinese government develop a water security strategy between sort of now and 2030, and I'll come back to that in a second. But because of this kind of, or sort of as a result of this breadth working across the water sector, we've kind of come up with 5 principles that we think are important to incorporate in water resource policy. And the first of those is we think that that policy needs to be efficient. So it needs to kind of construct a framework where using a given volume or quantity of water does result in maximum kind of economic benefit or maximize the welfare gain, depending on how you want to think of it. And then the second thing is that it needs to be environmentally sustainable. So it needs to have mechanisms in place to ensure that there is sufficient water available for the use of natural ecosystems, so that we can preserve ecosystem services and biodiversity, and not everything is withdrawn for human use, which we do see in some very stressed river basins, including in the Yellow River in China, the Colorado historically, at least here in the United States. As well. The third thing is it needs to be resilient. So particularly, again, with respect to water infrastructure, we need to make sure that we're building in essentially climate proofing principles into that, design principles. We need to make sure that both our infrastructure and our agricultural systems are equipped to deal with extreme water shocks, both in the case of floods as well as droughts. Water policy also needs to be equitable. So it's got to provide all people living in all places with safe, dependable sources of drinking water and sanitation. That's something that the World Bank has historically been very focused on. We remain very focused on that, and we have a very strong belief that that needs to be a core principle of water policy as well. And then the final thing, which is in some ways maybe the most difficult, is it's got to be fiscally viable. Historically, this has been a really big challenge in the water sector. As was mentioned, water infrastructure is enormous capital investments have historically been offered, mainly by the public sector, by central government treasuries, financed by central government treasuries, and lots of kind of hidden subsidies, really kind of horrific economics if you are looking at it from kind of an efficiency point of view. So we need to have water policy that kind of strips out some of those very obscure price signals and kind of has a more sustainable financial model, which we think involves blended finance increasingly. So in the case of China, I think in some ways China is probably the single most exciting laboratory for water policy reform right now. And a lot of those 5 principles are reflected in the types of reforms that China is trying to implement right now. And I won't go into too much depth now, but just to sort of highlight a couple of them. One approach that people generally advocate in conditions of water scarcity is water rights trading, which you can sort of think of at a very abstract level as kind of cap and trade for water. China has 7 pilot projects across 7 provinces in China, so it's one of the most kind of the biggest scale attempts to do this anywhere in the world. China has also, Professor Ma and I were talking about this yesterday, has implemented a pretty interesting volumetric pricing model for urban water users that's designed to sort of say, okay, well, we have one block where we'll charge people at a pretty low rate because that's effectively the amount of water you need for daily use. But when you go above that, we charge you higher. It's sort of a progressive fee structure. So again, an interesting kind of approach to that. China has also, almost uniquely, there are 1 or 2 other countries that have tried to do this, set a cap, at least an aspirational cap on total national water use, which is supposed to be implemented by 2030. And that's a really interesting policy that is supposed to then sort of cascade down through the system, creating lots of incentives for water conservation. So a lot of really interesting policy reforms. At the same time, though, China is, of course, a leader in developing kind of big water infrastructure, large-scale water diversions, desalination, so a lot of kind of traditional supply augmentation as well. And so I think that also feeds into this interesting tension or this interesting kind of mix of experimentation. Lots of kind of challenges remain, but I mention a few of those things to say I think China's a particularly good country to be focusing on if you're interested in water. The third and final thing I'll just say is a little bit about kind of water and climate change. I've, of course, worked a lot on climate change in the past, and what we're kind of trying to do now is to better integrate some of these global water resource issues, as I said, into that kind of climate agenda. And I do think it's really important that we see the two as very connected. I mean, the most obvious dimension is, of course, adaptation. I think David St. Pierre had this great line that if you're in water, you believe in climate change. That's absolutely true. And most of what we're concerned about in terms of climate change impacts in one way or another relate to the changing distribution and availability of water. And I think it's critical that we kind of recognize that and incorporate water as the main principle for how we think about adaptation. But I'd also just say briefly and in closing that there's also a significant kind of mitigation story going on here. We've touched a little bit on the kind of water-energy nexus, but it is truly important. Depending on where you are in the world, the energy sort of cost, the emissions associated with producing, transporting, purifying water are somewhere between 1/5 to 1/3 of total emissions. That's certainly the case in countries like Jordan that are very water scarce, but even in California, it's about 20-25%. So it's a non-trivial part of the emissions puzzle, and I think that it's critical that we kind of, as people being interested in the water sector, we also try to think about that story and how to translate the kinds of challenges that we're confronting into this broader global climate and sustainability agenda. So I'll stop there, and I'll look forward to some discussion. Thank you.
Thanks. Great, thank you so much, Scott. I'm currently teaching an economics and environmental policy course. So those 5 criteria that you laid out, I think, are hugely important. And since I don't see any of the students here, I'll take that back to them. So with that, I'd like to turn over to Professor Templeton, who's going to.
Great.
Thank you very much. And I also want to say a real thanks to my colleagues at the University of Chicago Law School and just underscore the point about the engagement with China. Just last March and then in June, I was able, with support of the university, to hold a conference here in Chicago and in Beijing looking at comparative environmental governance. So it's just wonderful to see the university continuing the dialogue between the two countries. I want to focus my remarks kind of on the idea of a reconceptualization of utilities. I think that historically people have thought of utilities, if they have thought of them at all, as big and boring, right? These are things that you want to have as reliable. So as Professor Corsi was saying, I don't need to know where the power comes from. It comes from the outlet, right? I don't need to know where the water goes. I just know that it is dealt with. When it's wastewater or when the drinking water comes, it just comes in. And so people have an expectation of reliability and an expectation that if it's not cheap, at least it's affordable relative to other things. But what I think we are seeing, and I want to kind of compare energy to water in this regard, is a movement from these kind of centralized approaches to more decentralized approaches. Obviously, the analogy does not hold fully, but I want to talk a little bit about this. Obviously, in water, we've talked about the kind of traditional gray infrastructure, right? The big pipes, the big conveyances, and the big treatment plants, right? This would be analogous to the big nuclear power plants or coal-fired power plants, the big transmission lines, where this has been pretty much seen as an efficient way of delivering service. But as we see in the energy sector, right, there's a push towards more localized solutions. So you can think about distributed generation, people putting solar panels on their roofs, people implementing energy efficiency technologies in their own buildings. This is somewhat analogous to what we were talking about with the sponge city and green infrastructure, right? Where the resource is captured and contained and then really used at the locality, with the backup being kind of the bigger infrastructure system. And so in both of these regards, you see smaller scale installations versus the historic bigger installations. You see more private actors participating, right? So it's about individual property owners making investments and decisions in terms of providing these kinds of services, whether it is building in the retention ponds or putting in permeable paving, or again, comparatively putting in the solar panels and things like that. You know, why do we see this in the water space? Well, part of the reason we see this in the water space is because we continue to have problems despite the massive investments that have taken place. 40 years ago, over 40 years ago, Congress updated the Federal Water Pollution Control Act, the Clean Water Act of 1972, and established two goals, right? The national goal is that the discharge of pollutants into navigable waters be eliminated by 1985. It's a second goal, that where attainable, an interim goal of water quality which provides for the protection and propagation of fish, shellfish, and wildlife, and provides for recreation in and on the water shall be achieved by July 1st, 1983. We still have significant impaired waters in the United States. So it just depends upon which survey that you look at what point in time. But roughly half of our lakes are in poor or fair condition. Roughly 60% of the coasts are in fair or poor condition, looking at water quality indicators. Roughly half the rivers and streams are in poor biological condition, with another 25% in fair condition. So while a lot of progress has been made compared to where we were in the 1950s and 1960s when the Cuyahoga River caught on fire in Ohio, we still have a long way to go. We also see, as has been mentioned, kind of more of a return to urban areas, right? So Chicago, people think about the Great Lakes the Lake Michigan shoreline, we have essentially a comparable number of miles along rivers. And Mayor Emanuel and others have talked about if the front yard of Chicago is Lake Michigan, then the backyard is the river system. And so we are investing a lot of money in using these river systems more. Boathouses have been put out there. There's even a Genie Gang designed boathouse, which is going at the intersection of the Ship and Sanitary Canal and Bubbly Creek. So we see kind of more demand and desire for amenities taking place. It's also, I see kind of an interest in these kinds of solutions because obviously the aging infrastructure itself is hard to replace. Again, a variety of different estimates. The American Society of Civil Engineers estimates it would take $3.6 trillion to invest in U.S. infrastructure to upgrade the country's support systems to acceptable levels. And we continue to have issues with, again, upgrading the gray infrastructure system, but also, which kind of ties back to the stormwater and the green infrastructure piece in the urban areas. Non-point sources are amongst the major sources of pollution, and particularly in terms of nutrients. So we see a need for newer solutions. I think we also kind of generally sort of looking back to the energy domain, there's this idea of small being beautiful, looking at what we can do with technology and distributing technology, hope that we can do more with better sensors and things like that as well. And for this to be successful in terms of more distributed approaches, I as a policy person think that you obviously have to get the regulations right. So on the sponge city side of things, right, you need to make sure that there are appropriate zoning or building codes or stormwater retention ordinances in place to impose requirements upon people who own property or who are developing property. I also believe that regulatory flexibility is appropriate. Obviously, you can't do certain things in certain areas, but you can have essentially trading systems or offsets that can be achieved other places to achieve these objectives. I think that you have to get the financial incentives correct, right? So whether that is through grants or tax abatements or low interest loans, things to help facilitate these kinds of investments. And there's also a question of fees. How do you use things like stormwater utility fees to then feed back into helping to fund some of these green infrastructure type investments in the urban areas, or other funding mechanisms to help in the more rural areas? So the USDA's NRCS program has been very successful in terms of helping to fund soil and water conservation efforts. Again, it has to be distributed, right, because you're dealing with individual landowners out in these areas. So I think we need to kind of further refine and double down on these kinds of strategies. So while I'm a big proponent of these strategies, I also want to acknowledge that there still remains a role for the big central kind of utilities, right? The distributed solutions, as in energy, are great until the sun is not shining in your area or until your retention pond is full, right? Then you want to have the backup. So you need to continue to make the investments in the big infrastructure systems to provide reliability. They also provide a coordination function as well. An oversight and monitoring function so that people are actually making these investments in distributed forms of dealing with stormwater or other forms of runoff. And obviously this requires a lot more collaboration in terms of different funding sources, different governmental entities, and there can still be a strong role for government even as private actors are taking a greater role in this. So look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. I know there's probably a lot of questions, so I'll maybe just ask one or two to get us started. And I wanted to come back to this idea of water pricing that I think almost everybody has raised, and the idea that, we're talking about, when Don started talking about that water was too cheap here, and then hearing from Dr. Ma that water's even cheaper in China for certain users. And so I'm wondering if we could talk about sort of two things with respect to water pricing. The equity part of it, and I know that that came up as well, and thinking about equity across different types of users, so agricultural users and industrial users, but also within users, so for different households, and how equity can be addressed through better water pricing. I wonder if anyone wants to take that on.
Okay, maybe first.
Sure.
Yeah, talking about equity of we talk about one equity is between the sectors, right? Like the commercial sector and also agriculture. Another one between the households, and I think depending on what's the right now the pricing, and for existing pricing policy, in China, I think the equity between the sectors actually not a problem, because actually industry also paid very less. Even they pay some money, but in comparison with the profit they already have, this money paid for what is nothing. So China's industry last year, the pure profit is $1 trillion US. $1 trillion US. 6 trillion RMB. But how much they paid for water use totally? You cannot imagine that. It's about so there's it's about in RMB it's 30 billion. It's about how much? It's 30 billion RMB. It's about it's almost nothing for the payment. It's almost the same as agriculture. In China, the number one payment made by the residential use, by people in urban area, even more than the paid by the industry. So that's why there's another equity. I think it's not fair. But if we would increase the pricing, that's another equity problem. But right now, actually, already a lot of money paid by the government. For example, like the infrastructure. Almost all the pipeline built by the government. But the industry are using these pipelines without any charge. So if we finally will increase or raise the rate, I think still, I believe, for the citizens, they will not pay that much money because they already pay tax. They pay tax to get a public service. But we should full cost to the industries. So I think that's fine. There's the equity, for the by sector, also by household.
I think the analogies between China and the United States are much deeper than most people think about. The eastern part of the United States is wet, and the problems of water in the eastern part of the United States are really about water quality, not quantity so much. Western part of the United States is dry, and quantity is dominated over quality. China's not much different. China in the west is dry. Quantity is important there. The east, it's wet, very wet, and quantity. The other analogy is that in both countries, agriculture has had a good deal for a long, long time. The other analogy is we all talk about crises. I'm being a little broad-brushed here, but for the following reason. None of us on this stage would be here talking about a lot of things we're talking about now if the pricing structure was a little bit more fair. And the writing's on the wall. Basically, if agriculture will give up a little bit of their subsidized or free water, the urban problems would disappear immediately. The numbers in the western part of this country are that if the agricultural users gave up 5% of the water they're using, 5%, that's all, you could flood. Everybody could have a swimming pool, 2 swimming pools in Los Angeles if they wanted. It's easy. The question from a policy point of view is how do you get from where we are to that reality? And I think whether we like it or not, it's going to involve, we can't just say, okay, we're raising the prices on agricultural water. They are a special interest. It's really difficult to do that politically. But if you can come to a system where you can set up an arrangement where there's a trade, either in a formal market like I've studied or in a more less formal market, where the urban areas are able to start to buy and to capture some of that agricultural water, then many of the problems we're talking about will be solved. That's the big picture. How do we get there is the devil's in the details.
Scott, did you?
I was just going to say two things. I mean, I think first of all, your question kind of gets at the classic kind of efficiency versus equity issue. I think part of the way out of that in this case is that valuing water, and this is something that we're currently at the World Bank trying to get sort of a better or kind of a set of principles around, but valuing water doesn't necessarily mean pricing. Pricing is one mechanism for valuing water, but there are multiple values of water, not all of which are easily captured in a price, in an upfront price. We are trying to grapple, for example, with how you assess or incorporate cultural and spiritual values of water, ecological values of water, which again are not easily captured in price. And I think that's important because it does kind of help to focus our attention on the issue of equity and on these kind of on these broader issues. And I would say one other kind of related thing: there are very few countries in the world where we make explicit consensus-based decisions about how we're going to use our water. In other words, how much water we're going to use for agriculture versus drinking water versus indigenous communities versus the environment. Very few cases where we have the institutions to do that. Much more often it's implicit. It's, a certain group of people get together, lobby the government to build an irrigation system, and they divert water from a river and effectively capture that water. But we don't really make those decisions in a kind of consensus-based approach. So I think part of the answer too is we need to focus on these kind of decision-making institutions in the water sector so that we can make those decisions and that they have legitimacy for all water users.
Anything to
I would just add, I guess, kind of thinking back to the energy analogy for a moment, that obviously price matters, but it's also a question of how much and relative to the transaction costs. So if you think that, I think it was in Portland, Oregon, it's roughly a $10 per month charge for a stormwater fee, versus people who are spending a couple $100 a month on for their electricity, right? It's much easier to kind of get over the transaction costs of investing in a solar system to put on your roof, as opposed to, what are you going to do to deal with the stormwater in your own area? So in which case, then it points that you might need things which are kind of just more subsidies. Otherwise, the transaction costs are going to kind of overwhelm it. So you can put in price, but it still matters, how does it compare to transaction costs and other costs that you're facing as well.
Sure, and I think, Scott, you bring up an important point with the cultural and ecological type of values, and for better or worse, economists like Don and myself think we can monetize those values too, which then can be reflected in this price. That's this full cost, or something that Dr. Mo was talking about. So I think I just wanted to ask one more question related to what Mark had just said here, and this idea that the sponge city that's come up a lot, and green infrastructure, and using the natural system. David St. Pierre talked a bit about how MWRD is doing this on the lands that they own, and we think about the city doing it on the public lands. How do you get private landowners to engage in better water conservation or stormwater management or green infrastructure? Because certainly we think about Chicago, there's a lot of privately owned land, and we want the stormwater infrastructure to be connected, whether it's green or not green. It's better, it functions better if it's connected. Do you have any ideas about that? Mark, you look like.
Well, sure. I mean, obviously, you can charge. There can be a fee, and then depending upon what people do, you can rebate them a portion of the fee. You can also, give building incentives, right? So in the same way that you can allow for more, if people have more open space on a block when they're developing, they can go higher. You can do similar kinds of things in terms of letting them build higher. You can help subsidize investment in green roofs and things like that. So there are a number of different kinds of tools, either subsidies, direct subsidies, loans, or other, relief from other regulatory requirements that can help.
Right. Anyone else? Great. Well, I think I'd like to open it up to questions now. If there's, I'm sure there's many. or certainly if any of you have questions of each other,
Okay, yeah.
I'm sure as well. Yes.
So Don brought out this question about fear and water pollution data. So all the information you were getting from your city about the water pollution, pollutants, and the new things being measured, and the fear from there. So I was wondering, any thoughts on how that might be mitigated, perhaps like in food and labeling, right? There's a lot of data, but we don't seem to have fear for food and its things. So I'm just wondering, any thoughts on how that fear might get mitigated?
It's an unbelievably good question, and it encompasses the mind of maybe a quarter of all social scientists right now. The easy answer is that we're talking about numbers that are really hard for anybody to comprehend. I know you're a smart guy. I can tell you that there's 4 parts per billion of something in your water. But what does that mean? And I think risk communication and risk coordination is the only way we've figured out how to get around that in the short run. So for instance, you can tell even the people in my very educated, wealthy neighborhood that there's a new thing we're measuring this year and it has this many parts per billion, but what does that mean? But if you tell them that a part per billion is the equivalent of the following. You take an acre, say a football field or a soccer field, very close to an acre, and you put a wall around it 43 feet high and fill it with water and put a drop of something in, and that's 1 part per billion, right? And then comparing that to other risks that they take voluntarily versus not, and putting it on what usually is called in the business a risk ladder. You can get people to calm down about that. The big thing about water and some other areas of environmental policy is that for much of our history, public policy was about getting people that are ignoring risk to start caring about it. When I was a kid, if you wanted to get a driver's license, you had to go and take some courses. And I don't remember anything about them at all, except the black and white movies of real people dying in real car accidents. And boy, that made teenage guys like me put their seatbelts on. So that's pretty easy. It's easy to scare people. A lot of what's going on in the environmental policy area, in particular with water, is getting the people that are overreacting to it to at least think about it more rationally. And these techniques, we can talk about this more later, involve basically communicating quantitative data in a qualitative way that puts things in a relative fashion that people can digest. Hard business.
And I think this raises a really important point about what you brought up as well, about sometimes people don't think at all about water until the hot water runs out or until you don't get any water out of your tap. But at the same time, after a crisis, as you brought up, like what we saw in Flint, Michigan, there's a huge reaction to it when everyone starts testing their water and thinking their drinking water is no longer safe. And so trying to figure out the right type of information to get to people on a regular basis is really important. Any other questions that we can? Yes.
So you guys all talked about some of the deficiencies in both the U.S. and China that affect how we use water and how we manage water. We keep hearing about Singapore and Israel as 2 places where the behaviors are pretty good. High recycle and usages per capita is less. How much of that is policy? And is there someplace else that you would highlight as a place where they kind of have policy and incentives right to help the society manage water effectively?
Okay. Okay, please, you go ahead.
I was just going to say a little bit about Israel and Singapore, because you're right; those are the 2 examples that people that are easy to point to. I think I would, if I were to answer your question very very directly, I would say it's probably 40% policy, 60% culture. What's interesting about those 2 countries is that they're, of course, both small countries, and for different reasons, water has a strategic importance and has had for the entire history, independent history of both of those countries. One thing that isn't maybe as well known about in Israel, that's a little bit more obvious. In the case of Singapore, what's interesting is until very recently, Singapore was entirely dependent on Malaysia for its water supply. It's also why Singapore has, on a per capita basis, one of the most powerful militaries in the world. They were sort of wanted to be very sure that they could actually secure their sources of water if need be. So the point is that there are these kind of historical and I think cultural factors that I think really shaped those two countries in particular, and I think why they're kind of in a comprehensive sense such good models. But I would also say, depending on which kind of piece of the puzzle you're looking at, there are other really interesting models. France, if you're sort of interested in the institutional issues as I am, France has this really interesting system where they've created what they call water parliaments, which are representative bodies that are actually empowered to tax water users within each of the country's 6 major river basins. So not only are they kind of these like specialized water legislatures, but they're also organized around river basin lines, which if you're a kind of water person, that's sort of like the gold standard. So there are a couple of other, depending on which issue slice of it, there are other really good models, but I think those two countries in particular, they have these historical factors that are important.
Yes. I will give you some kind of understanding about your question. And just, you said that's correct. It depending on the different countries, China is a big country, Singapore and Israel is much smaller. But I know in Israel, their agriculture, when agriculture use water, the price higher than the residential use. But Beijing and Israel have same, water problem, the challenge. Beijing's water per capita same as Israel, so we should have very strong, very pressed, water challenge. But we have different, solution, because as China is a big country, so we prefer, not reuse the water, but transfer water from the Yangtze River. That's nobody have done that before. That water transfer from Yangtze River, cross the Yellow River, down to the Hai River, cross the one river basin. We have done that. So that's a different policy. This policy helped Beijing to reduce the risk for water. Also, this project subsidized by the government dramatically. So that's a solved water problem in Beijing. But I would say, but we still have no risk in Beijing, in many other cities in China. So for example, even the water shortage in Beijing too, but also the water quality very poor. So Beijing citizens paid about 3 billion RMB for the tap water, but same people pay another 10 billion to buy the bottled water. That's 3 times of the payment for the the tap water. That showed how people evaluate the water, the risk, not only for the amount but also for the quality. So we still bad just because some kind times the policy conflict. So that water resource policy help Beijing to solve the water challenge. So that's why China we could have the water from other places. Right now, all the provincial capital cities in Beijing are drinking the water from other places, not the local water. All the water drink by the Chinese big cities, transferred from other places, not locally. So that is in China's solution for the water risk.
Tom kind of beat me to the punch about Israel, and I just wanted to point out, first of all, we have a strong relationship in the IME with Ben-Gurion University, and that's given us some insight into there. One of the, things that's unique about Israel is that very early in the history of their country, as Scott alluded to, they had a Israel water law that says that the state of Israel owns every drop of water in the country, no matter where it comes from, even if you pump it out of your own land. I think that's not going to happen here anytime soon. But to sort of flip the question around, you've been talking about ideas. Do you see in the political landscape of either country places where interesting ideas are being done politically to move in a positive direction?
Well, maybe I'll just quickly jump in on that. I mean, the U.S., as you pointed out with your comment, we don't really have a national water policy. We actually did kind of have one in the 1960s, and then it was defunded, essentially. But anyway, the result of that is we have a lot of kind of like we have a very sort of diverse set of outcomes. But the Colorado is a really interesting example where it used to be a kind of very competitive kind of conflict-oriented environment, but over the last 15 to 20 years, it's really become a much more cooperative or a scene of much better cooperation. I mentioned earlier environmental flows, and the Colorado had this really big success about 3 years ago where an amendment to the U.S.-Mexico treaty that governs the Colorado was added to ensure that there's a minimum stream flow in the lower Colorado, which hadn't existed for 50 or 60 years. So for the first time, there's water in the lower Colorado. So I think that's a good example of where there's some good and promising things happening.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. Yes.
No, on the quality side, there's water quality trading that's being implemented in the Chesapeake Bay, which is exciting to many and terrifying to others. And I think any trading regime depends upon good measurement and verification. And there's a lot of concern among the environmental community is quite divided over this. And so it'll just be interesting to kind of see how this plays out over time, the extent to which you can do, cap and trade in a watershed. I mean, like really do it as opposed to what's being done under the Clean Water Act with TMDLs.
I think depending on the decision making, based on what kind like the range or the scope. If right now is all the water policy, it's a nationwide, it's national policy. But if we would have the local or even regional policy for water use, that would be very different. For example, like the Beijing, if right now Beijing raised the water price dramatically, it's very good. But at the same time, we could have the water from Yangtze River. That reduced the pressure. And even for the watershed, we have the policy based on the high river basin. That's the Beijing and Tianjin and the Hebei province. There's still water is a shortage in this area. And even for that, it would be much better than some kind of national policies. In 1950s, Beijing built up 2 huge reservoirs. The 2 reservoirs, the capacity right now can cover 3 Beijing, existing Beijing. They built up the 2 reservoirs in 1950s because the 2 reservoirs to protect Beijing from flooding, not from the water shortage. That's why we built up the reservoirs. But 50 years later, no, we have no water. We have to transfer water from Yangtze River. But these 2 reservoirs only 100 kilometers from Beijing. So that's the policy made by the central government. They don't care. They ask local people to use the water in the upstream of Beijing, then the transport from 1,000 kilometers away to transport. Also, that's national policy. So that's why you said that the politics for the water use, for the policy, and really based on even Beijing decision making will be very locally. That will be totally different. Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you can link water pricing with social inequality. I grew up in California where water fines and water restrictions had a disproportionate impact on the poor who could not buy water-efficient appliances or fix pipes, or if they were fined, that fine meant something relative to people who were willing to continue with the big swimming pools and the lawns and all of that. So as we talk about water policy, is there a role for thinking about social inequality, or how you might take that into account with any kind of model that might be put together?
Who knows what? California water policy?
Or just maybe
Yeah.
this is for Scott. You were saying we need to go beyond water policy to think about culture and practices. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a difficult thing to implement in practice, and one kind of really fundamental issue, kind of I think underlying our panel, at least from my perspective, is there's not really any. This is extremely location dependent. Actually, I guess that came up in the previous panel too. But there really isn't a good uniform solution across countries. It means something very different to be considering a regressive impact of water pricing in California versus China versus Jordan, which is actually a really interesting case right now because of the magnitude of the refugee crisis that they're facing and the tremendous stresses on Jordan's water supply. Even as they've tried to implement a very sophisticated pricing reform. But it's kind of like, how are you going to do that when you have this, this enormous challenge? I think that this kind of tiered pricing model that China has recently started to implement. Professor Ma knows more than I do about this, but I think strikes me as the right approach. So you basically say, there's a certain quantity of water that is necessary for daily use, and we're going to basically supply that at a very low, possibly subsidized rate. But then once you kind of start moving up the volume chain, it's progressive, so you do pay more. That strikes me as a good general policy principle. But of course, even there are lots of complications. How do you do that in an agricultural context, which is generally 70+% of water use in any given country? So.
But for the social equity, in California, I know something. I have done some survey there. Very different by cities. Some cities in California, no charge for water use, actually included in the property tax. But some cities charge full cost. Big difference. So that really depending on what kind of policy, in the different cities. I believe in that city, no charge, but included in the property tax. I think that would be very simple, very easy. For poor people, no need to pay any fee for the water use. But I think in most American cities, they charge the water separately, not included in the tax. But in China, I think right now, actually the government already paid, even the charge is very low, but the government already paid at least 60% of the cost for building the pipeline and the facilities. But I believe we would raise the tariff, but not only for the residential people. That's mainly for the industry, for commercial facilities. They should pay the full cost. For the citizens, still they just pay the very limited money. But the government should pay another money, another cost. That finally form the full cost. So that is also that will be very, very good for the social equity. Yeah.
Well, I think we're out of time, and I just to close, I wanted to return to where we started with Don's talk about thinking about the human side of water and how humans interact and think about water from a scarcity and a water quality perspective, and this ideas of risk and how our water policy will affect different users differently, and talking about equity, which has come up several times. So I just wanted to thank everybody for your great insights on this, and we're looking forward to the next panel on engineering and technology. Thank you.